Namaskar. Today is the 119th birthday of Prakash Narayan. Some say that Prakash Narayan is possibly one of the most underrated leaders of India. Prakash Narayan, some people say, is possibly one of the most tallest leader in India post-independence. There are a lot of stories about Prakash Narayan. There are a lot of myths about Prakash Narayan. Prakash Narayan was this, a lot of people say that Prakash Narayan had this huge hate for Indira Gandhi. So let's discuss all of this. Let's discuss all of this and understand a little more about Prakash Narayan. For this discussion, I have somebody who knew Prakash Narayan very closely. I have Mr. Satish Jha, who used to know Mr. Prakash Narayan, who has seen him closely, who worked with him when he was very young, of course, but he has worked with him closely. And Mr. Satish Jha, co-founder of Janasatta, Mr. Satish Jha, editor of Janasatta. Let's talk to him and find out more about Prakash Narayan. Jha Saab, thank you so much for joining us in HW English.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Sir, what exactly was Mr. Prakash Narayan's ideology? Was he a Marxist? Was he a socialist? Was he a Congressy? What was his ideology actually?
If I had to put that in one word, I would say Prakash Narayan's ideology was how to be a model citizen. Having said that, his evolution was from Marxism in America. Just imagine learning Marxism in America. How does this sound to you?
Absolutely.
But the timing was such that Russia had just become a Marxist state, and he saw that it was going to go on the right path, and he got influenced by that in America. When he came to India in 1929, after 7 years in Berkeley, Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio, where he studied in various universities, and he went to many schools because he couldn't afford pay fees for one school. So he had to do a lot of work. When he came here, he could not relate to the communist movement in India because that was looking towards overseas. And he became part of the nationalist movement influenced by Nehru's personality. His persona was towering. But more than that, he had been part of Gandhi's setup even before he left for America. His wife, Prabhavati ji, was already in Gandhiji's ashram by the time. She was full-time there. And then he came back and became a disciple of Gandhiji. So, and then for about next 12 to 14 years, he was in and out of jail until 46. And that's when Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, who was one of the great poets of Bihar and nation, he said that Prakash is going to shape the future of the country. And when India became free, he did not wish to join the government because he was a quintessential citizen rather than a person who wanted power. And he moved on, and he was offered vice presidentship of India. He declined that as well. And in 1957, he decided to become a sannyasi from Rajniti. He took kind of sannyas from Rajniti. And then for 26 years, he remained until situations demanded his intervention. In fact, people asked him to intervene. And he also had a certain situation and need to be recognized at that point in time that the world had forgotten him. He didn't want that, he couldn't live with it. And that's what led to his talking about total revolution. In between, he dabbled with Sampurn Kranti, Sarvodaya, Bhudan, and all that. But his goal was the last citizens' welfare, not the government.
Isn't it ironic? JPG came to India. He was impressed with Nehru. He left his ideology, his Marxist ideology, went into nationalist ideology or Congressy ideology, whatever you want to call it, joined Nehruji and joined Congress, my apologies. But somewhere down the line, he never wanted to join the Nehru cabinet. Why that decision?
The way I saw Jayaprakash ji, he was never the one who sought power. And being in the government requires you to be someone who is constant supporter of the prime minister. That's something he probably can't find. And he told Nehru that our ideas are so different that it won't make sense for us to be in the same government. And he remained outside for the next 4 or 5 years. And 57, he decided to take sannyas from Rajniti. That's what he decided. So basically, he never felt comfortable being inside the government. And he was obviously in the beginning a nationalist, and therefore he remained a Congressy. And around 50s, the socialist parties started getting formed. Lohia was one segment. He was with Acharya Narendra Dev, who was the tallest among them all. And then PDL Tandon came, Purushottam Das Tandon, Kripalani, Dada Dharmadhikari. So he found more, you can say, a much better common ground with these people than people who sought power. As you can see, Tandon never wanted to be anything. Narendra Dev didn't want to be. Kriplani himself remained. His wife became chief minister, but he didn't become. So the Dharmadhikari, Patwardhan, none of them wanted to be in power. They were thinkers of society. They wanted the nation to be like something good for the citizen, but they didn't want power for themselves. So JP represented that segment of society which wanted to be a model citizen, wanted good for India, good for the last person, a great India without seeking power for themselves. That was more, you can say, a continuous we can say a thread in evolution of Jayaprakash Narayan, that he will not be in the government. He'll always be asking the government what they should do.
He always referred to Jawaharlal Nehru as a friend. How was their personal relationship?
I can say one thing. Nehru always wanted him to join the cabinet. He actually, even Shastri was used by Nehru more as a personal secretary. Shastri was the person who would carry Nehru's file. Shastri was devoted to Nehru. Jayaprakash Narayan was the tallest of them all. And don't forget that Nehru had a very diverse cabinet. He brought in people he did not see eye to eye with. But Jayaprakash Narayan was the only one. I mean, you had Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, he had Krishnamurti, and he had all kinds of, he got Mathai, many people who joined his cabinet. They joined because they were very evolved professionals or people of a certain achievement. They did not become members of his cabinet because they were politicians alone. So he saw the personal qualities of each one of them to bring them into the government. Jayaprakash Narayan was the only one who declined consistently to join because he was always, maybe he was afraid of being inside the government. Maybe he felt much more comfortable outside. He could be subordinate. If you ask me, that's the reason I didn't join the government. When Mr. Rajiv Gandhi asked me in '87, I was editor of the Demand. It was a very natural transition for me. He invited me to Rajya Sabha. I just couldn't resist telling him, my correspondents become members of parliament, because I had this terrible what you call way of looking at it, that I can't be subordinate. JP had the same problem. I think I learned it from him, that subordination was not something he could live with, nor could I, from that point of view. So I think that defined him much more than anything else.
Mrs. Gandhi, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, I think her biggest opposition, the biggest competitor she had ever, right from her initial days in politics to possibly her last day in politics, the biggest competition she faced was not Morarji Desai. It was, or not Atal Bihari Vajpayee, it was Jayaprakash Narayan. Sir, how was Mrs. Gandhi's relationship with Jayaprakash Narayan, and how did Mr. Jayaprakash Narayan look at Mrs. Gandhi?
From my point of view, the way I saw it, he was very fond of Indira Gandhi on the one hand, but he was not able to live with the way she was handling the government in '73, '74, but particularly the High Court judgment.
Correct.
He wanted her to listen to the people and etc. And she was not able to handle that process. And again, if you see, he was not an opponent of Indira Gandhi. He was opposing the government. He never opposed Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi became a symbol of that at that point in time. And Jayaprakash Narayan was a symbol of the opposition that galvanized around him. And people took advantage of Jayaprakash Narayan. They came and, as they say, baked their political bread in Jayaprakash Narayan's tandoor in that sense. So that was it. But Jayaprakash Narayan himself was looking at opposing a government which was not doing its job. He did not oppose Indira Gandhi. That's exactly why what happened is, after she lost the election, he was going to meet Indira Gandhi. And when he went to meet Indira Gandhi, people asked him, everybody opposed Rajdharan, included Rajdharan, was the most vocal of them all. He just said, मैं इंदिरा से मिलने जा रहा हूँ, मेरे बड़े भाई की बेटी से मिलने जा रहा हूँ, प्रधानमंत्री से नहीं. So he had that feeling for her too. So he had a human side to it and a government side to it. So he stood, it's a complex personality. There's a state, vis-a-vis state, I'm a model citizen. But people are different. And he treated them the same way, everyone. He treated them as citizens, human beings, and the role they had. On role, he had a very different and I think more straightforward approach. He was less forgiving when it came to role. He was more forgiving when it came to human frailties.
Doesn't that talk volumes about the political situation, politicians those days?
Because you see, when you come out of the nationalist struggle, which was such a long one, the best of India became the leaders. And these are stronger of the India, they became the leaders. And they came out of it in the beginning. But once you became free, the whole context changed. And the politics got its own color and name the way it evolved. And the people who were honest, they wanted to become professionals. They didn't come to politics as such. And politics became the business of politicians rather than business of basically competent citizens who thought of building a nation. Because to get people of all competencies to fight against a foreign power was much easier. But now that you had become a free nation, you found various callings, etc., and you were happy with it. You kept struggling with a lot of things as such, but politics of poverty was not something everybody was going to deal with. And I think the opening of American possibilities also took away a lot of talent from India, and America became the single largest beneficiary of Indian talent. About 4 million Indians are there, and they earn about 25% of India's GDP. Those 4 million people, and you can see those possibilities. So I think the talent in political pool shrunk around those who were power hungry. In the beginning, those who came, they were fighting to snatch the control of nation from the foreign power. Now they were power hungry. They wanted seats and positions and states and so on and so forth to run the states. So there's a different, you can say, complexion of politics. And in this politics, you haven't found any national leader of a stature that we had in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s.
Correct.
And that's something we have to think about why it happened. And there's a good point of discussion some point in time.
Sir, while a lot of people saw Jayaprakash Narayan as an inspiration, they were inspired by him, they were influenced by him. Lalu Prasad Yadav or like Sushil Modi, Nitish Kumar, even to a certain extent Mulayam Singh Yadav were inspired by JPG. But finally, they all went their own ways. They were never united under JPG. Is that a fact, sir?
Very, very true fact, actually, because I'll tell you what, the way I see it. Their goals and their ambitions and aspirations were not as high as JP's. JP's aspirations were national. They were about India, about the world. He was talking about world peace, the International Peace Research Conference he organized in 1973, November. 100 countries came. As a single person, he could organize that, talk about the world peace. Even though he was not in the government, he thought of the world as such. And that's why I got a lot of global things because of Jayaprakash's conference as such. But what I would say is he was not looking for power. Everybody who came to Jayaprakash, they were all looking for power. They used him, and they consciously used him. But JP subconsciously got used. He didn't want to get used, but he got used. But his point was he still had to give that call. He still had to bring those who had interest in making India a greater place. And the kind of people they came, they were not the best of us. They were the Lalu Yadavs and the likes, etc. And they stood for everything JP did not stand for. They followed him to the extent that they wanted to be seen with him, identified with him, and then their policy was just opposite of what JP stood for. So therefore, all these people, from Mulayam Singh to Lalu to Nitish to Sushil, including George Fernandez probably was more Jayaprakashi than others, because he worked with him much longer. He was also president of Railway Men's Federation and so on and so forth. He was a labor movement leader. He was actually from the ground and national leader. So he probably was more Jayaprakashi and more Gandhian than all the other leaders you're talking about, the second generation leaders. And that's why you see the status of Bihar. You see the state of UP. And by the way, these leaders were predominantly UP Bihar belt. They were not. You don't find them so much in Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan. If you see that, you don't find so much in the south as such. So, but this was the main belt of India's heartland. So therefore, we think about them. So it primarily UP Bihar politics that got mostly influenced by JP, even though Navnirman Samiti and the kind of politics that changed in Gujarat, JP was invited to become the head of that. So Gujarat invited him there after he began talking about these issues in Bihar. So he became national in his own right, but his followers remained regional. His followers remained more power hungry. His followers remained how to use JP's connection to find a place for themselves, which they did. And Janata Party was again not a party with one ideology. It was a collection of, it was kind of, you can say, a congressy alternative to Congress party.
Would you agree to me if I say that possibly JPG was one of the most underrated leaders in India?
I would say that if you see from common man's point of view, both Gandhi and JP remain underrated, but JP was the tallest leader after Gandhi by any measure as a national leader. And probably Narendra Modi, in terms of leadership, will also be the next very important leader in the country when history is written of India. But in terms of transforming India, in terms of changing India, thinking of a great India, JP was way ahead of, next to Gandhi. No one came in between. Having said that, he was rated by the people who followed him. And he did not live long enough, beyond 4 years after starting his movement in 74. He passed away in 78. He didn't live long enough. And 78 is a very distant past. Don't forget, we are a nation where 50% population is under 21.
Correct.
They never saw Prakash Narayan. And our books don't talk so much about Prakash Narayan. And even though Prakash Narayan is somebody both Congress and the non-Congress government talk about, Doordarshan still talks about him every year. But Doordarshan is the only body that talks about him. The mainstream non-Doordarshan media doesn't talk about him. So thank you for thinking about JP at this point in time, because in the history of independent India, JP was, in post-independence, probably the tallest leader we have had.
How popular was he actually amongst people? He was called the Lok Nayak.
What
How popular was he?
I can tell you one example before he started that, and that was 1973, November, Banaras. I was walking with him. I went to a clothier shop. The shopkeeper did not get up for him. He said, do you know who I am? In Hindi, aap jante hain main kaun hu? He did not get up except hesitatingly. He said, Mera naam Prakash Narayan hai. There was no recognition on the shopkeeper's face. This is 1973, November. But by the time it was 74, and everybody, the whole nation knew his name. Having said that, after 78, who has heard of him? And there has been nothing in the scale of Gandhi. Actually, even Nehru will be forgotten the way we talk about, except for the institutions which still carry their name. So there are some institutions that remind us, but not at the same level as Gandhi and Nehru. But Prakash Narayan will probably be forgotten, and he'll be only a matter of history books, and only for the people who are learned about it. And that said, JP was underrated by the people, but politicians, those who know of him, they know that he was the tallest who walked in independent India.
Like you have the Gandhiism, like you have Nehruism now. There are Nehruvian theories. Do you think JP had to be classified into maybe something that he created of his own? Maybe there is a JPism.
I would think there is a possibility of creating that, and I see a thread from his evolution from
Correct.
Marxism to becoming total
Correct.
revolution.
Correct.
And my thread is in search of being the model citizen in a democracy. That's JP. He was beyond the Kranti of Lohia. He was beyond any limited ideology. He was beyond whatever any particular segment, be it RSS or be it anyone, could have. Nothing could contain him because he was India. He contained multitudes, and he was someone who was constantly looking for how to make sure that democracy becomes stronger. What did he talk about? How to make elections cheaper. He said, as long as elections remain expensive, our democracy is not safe. What has happened today? Other day, one politician told me they spend 15,000 rupees per vote in West Bengal. This is the cost of elections. 15,000 rupees per vote. As long as politics is this expensive, you cannot afford to have a democracy where the majority is represented. And that is what is happening today. Every question he raised is as relevant. So I say JPism will mean be a model citizen, stand up to the state. If you're a civil servant, stand up to the state, ask for constitutions to be most important, and ask for all the time and every day. Democracy is something which you correct every day. Democracy is something just cannot be taken for granted. That is Prakash Narayan.
His biggest call was total revolution. That was his biggest call. Sir, can you briefly tell me what total revolution meant?
Well, what he said was we have had a revolution of sorts. We talked about that. But what did it lead to? Nothing. Our poor are still poor. So he said, well, we have to change our governance. Bhrishtachar hatao. Corruption, remove corruption. Shiksha Mein Kranti Lao. He talked about Bauddhik Kranti. He talked about intellectual evolution of India. And, he was trying to create various pieces that would form the total revolution. But it was primarily about governance, about questions of development. It was about the questions of, you can say, law, civil rights and civil liberties, and intellectual evolution of the country as such. That's the way he planned it.
You personally had, you were too young then though, but you had a personal relationship with Jayaprakash Narayan.
It was, for me, it was like being at the right place at the right time. I was a teenager. I was about 15 years of age. And I got to know about the schooling system being so lopsided in India. The affluent went to better schools. And I discovered public schools, and I wanted my brothers to go there. So my younger brother got admission at Rajghat Business School. We moved to Rajghat. Rajghat was a corner of Banaras where Gandhi institutions were established, one by Jayaprakash Narayan, Narayan Desai, Mahadev Desai's son, who was Secretary of Gandhi, also stayed there. Sarvodaya, Sarva Seva Sangh, Gandhi Institute, and all these institutes were one campus it was. And I certainly am part of that campus. That allowed me to get to know Jayaprakash Narayan, along with Professor Nagesha Prasad, Subhat Dasgupta, the whole intellectual segment of what people who contributed to think tank of JP, they were all there. And I'm young. In the beginning, I looked at him as an old man. I could not understand the meaning of it. When I was told by Professor Prasad's son that Nehru offered JP to become vice president, he declined. I said, that's not possible. That's my thinking at that point in time. But then I was given a paper that JP wrote when he was in Ohio. It was 50 years before, and I couldn't understand anything reading it 10 times. And that's why I began to think about him as someone who could think 50 years back in a way that I can't even understand now. That got my interest perked up. And then I started walking with him. He used to come to Banaras 1 month every year. He'll come occasionally for Gandhi Institute board meetings, etc. That's the time I'll get to see him and meet him and walk with him. And like Jayaprakash Narayan, we learn a lot. And that's why then he involved me in International Peace Research Association conference held in November of 1973, where 100 countries were represented. It was a huge learning for me, and I was following what all is happening here. There were so many ideas bustling. I was trying to grapple with them somehow. And so Jayaprakash Narayan became slowly a person who was kind of an ideal citizen for me. For me, if India had among the leaders a model citizen, there's only one, and that's Jayaprakash Narayan, who sought nothing, who lived in Khatam Kuan, very simple life. He could have anything, he wanted nothing. If you see that, that is an ideal citizen who didn't seek power, any power given to him, he had no interest in that. And he became the person, he taught me that as a single person, you can bring down a nation's government. As a single person, you can demand to be independent and be a model citizen, where every Nagarik is more important than every other institutional representative as such. Constitution is supreme. Within that, we can demand everything for equality of citizens, for development, to create a great nation. That's our responsibility. That's what JP taught me. And that led me. I would think because of that, Ramnath Goenka somehow allowed me to start Jansatta, because he was the biggest funder of Jayaprakash Narayan. He was the biggest friend of Jayaprakash Narayan. He created a magazine called Every Man's with Ganga Sharan Singh, in whose house JP used to live, and my own father-in-law was the founding editor of that.
Okay.
So Babu Ganga Sharan Singh, Kuldeep Nayyar, Jit Bhattacharjee, and Mulgaonkar, they were the 4 members. And Om Prakash Deepak, my father-in-law, he was the founding editor of Every Man's. Every Man's became the voice of opposition to the government, not to Indira Gandhi. I would differentiate there. Jayaprakash Narayan was always against government that oppresses, not
individuals.
Like the Gandhi said, you fight the evil, not the person. So that's what he was. He was a deep-seated Gandhian in many ways. And that remained in him throughout. Gandhian values, if there was one leader who always exhibited throughout until the end of his life, that was Jayaprakash Narayan. A Gandhian, in true sense, a socialist, starting with a Marxist, but a model citizen who created a movement. He did not become opponent of Indira Gandhi. He was opponent of what she represented as the government. And that's the way Jayaprakash Narayan took this country forward. I wish we had leaders who followed his example and who were tall enough to take it forward to the next stage. But hopefully we'll have someone who will emerge out of it.
On that note, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
sir.